The laughter came first, sharp and sudden, cutting through the music like a blade through silk. Charlotte Hale stood near the edge of the ballroom floor, her gloved hands pressed together so tightly that her knuckles ached. Every candle in the grand hall of Ashcombe House burned bright above her, and every one of those flames seemed to throw light directly onto her face, as if the room itself wanted everyone to see her humiliation. 27 years old and still no ring on her finger, said a voice behind her, pitched just loud enough to carry. One does wonder what is wrong with the poor girl. Charlotte did not turn around. She had learned over the years that turning around only gave them more to laugh at. Instead, she lifted her chin a fraction higher and stared straight ahead at the dancers spinning across the polished floor, their silk gowns catching the candlelight like drops of colored glass. Perhaps nothing is wrong with her at all, said a second voice, softer, almost pitying, which somehow stung more than mockery ever could. Perhaps she is simply unwanted. A ripple of laughter followed, quiet but unmistakable, moving through the small cluster of women standing only a few feet away. Charlotte recognized every voice. She had grown up with these women, had once played with them as children in gardens far from this grand house, back when unkindness had not yet hardened into habit. She kept her back straight. She had promised herself on the carriage ride here that she would not let them see her flinch. Not tonight, not ever again. But it was hard, it was so terribly hard. Her mother's voice came to mind, from earlier that evening as they had dressed for the ball. You must smile more, Charlotte. You must not let them see that you mind. A woman who looks wounded only invites more wounds. Her mother meant well. Her mother always meant well. But her mother did not have to stand in the middle of a ballroom while women half her age whispered about her failures as though she were a horse that had not sold at market. The orchestra shifted into a new song, and Charlotte watched the couples change partners, watched the easy laughter between them, watched how the candlelight seemed kinder to everyone else in the room. She thought, not for the first time, that there was a particular kind of loneliness in standing at the edge of joy without being allowed to step into it. Miss Hale. She turned at the sound of her name, relieved to see a familiar face. Lucy Bennett, her dearest friend since childhood, was making her way through the crowd with 2 glasses of lemonade in her hands. You look like you are about to run straight through that window, Lucy said quietly, pressing one of the glasses into Charlotte's hand. Please do not. I only just had this dress altered. Despite everything, Charlotte felt the corner of her mouth lift. I promise I will use the door if it comes to that. Good, doors are far less dramatic and far less likely to result in a scandal about broken glass. Lucy glanced past Charlotte's shoulder toward the group of women who had gone quiet the moment she arrived. Were they at it again? When are they not? Lucy's jaw tightened, and for a moment Charlotte saw real anger flash behind her friend's eyes. I do not understand why we keep coming to these things. Because Mother believes that if I simply attend enough balls, a husband will eventually fall out of the ceiling and land at my feet. And has one yet. Not unless you count Lord Pembry's cousin, who fell asleep on that very settee an hour ago and nearly landed at my feet when he slid off it. Lucy laughed, a real laugh, and for a moment the tightness in Charlotte's chest eased. This was why she still came. Not for the husbands, not for the whispers, but for these small pockets of warmth she found in unexpected corners, with the one person who had never once made her feel small. Have you seen the guest list for tonight? Lucy asked, lowering her voice as though sharing a secret. They say the Duke of Rothmere has come. Lady Ashcombe's own nephew. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. Everyone in London had heard of the Duke of Rothmere, though few claimed to actually know him. He was spoken of the way people spoke of a storm on the horizon, with a mixture of respect and unease. He was known to be exceptionally wealthy, exceptionally powerful in matters of business and politics, and exceptionally cold to nearly everyone he met. I did not think he attended balls, Charlotte said. I thought he considered them a waste of his time. That is exactly what makes it interesting. Something must have changed, or someone must have convinced him, because half the room has already rearranged themselves to be seen near the entrance. Charlotte glanced toward the tall doors at the far end of the ballroom, more out of curiosity than any real interest. She had no illusions about dukes. Men of that rank did not concern themselves with women like her, women whose dowries had shrunk along with their families' fortunes, women who carried the quiet shame of a broken engagement from years past, women who had been discussed and dismissed so many times that the whispers had become a kind of permanent whether she simply lived inside. "I am sure he will find the evening as tedious as I do," Charlotte said, turning back toward the dance floor. "Powerful men rarely enjoy rooms they cannot control." "How very wise of you," Lucy said, smiling, "though I suspect you have never actually spoken to a duke in your life." "I have not, and I do not intend to start tonight." But even as she said it, something in the air of the ballroom had begun to shift. Conversations near the entrance had softened into a different kind of hush, the kind reserved for moments when something important was about to happen. Charlotte felt it before she understood it, the way one feels a change in weather before the first drop of rain falls. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself that whatever was happening at the far end of the room had nothing to do with her, that she would simply continue standing here at the edge of things, sipping her lemonade, waiting for the evening to end so she could go home and remove these tight, uncomfortable shoes. She was wrong, though she did not yet know it. Behind her, the whispering women had drawn closer again, emboldened by the safety of numbers and the certainty that no one of consequence was listening. "I heard he only agreed to come because his aunt threatened to cut off his allowance," one of them said, giggling. "Imagine, a duke controlled by an old woman's purse strings." "I heard it is because he is finally looking for a wife. His aunt has been pressing him for years." "Well, he certainly will not find one here." A pause, deliberate and cruel, "unless he has taken a sudden interest in charity." The laughter that followed was quiet, but Charlotte heard every note of it, and she understood, with the particular clarity that comes from long practice, that the comment had been aimed directly at her. She did not turn around this time either. She simply closed her eyes for the space of one breath, gathered whatever composure she had left, and reminded herself of the promise she had made in the carriage. She would not let them see her mind. Even if, deep down, in the quiet place she kept hidden from everyone, including herself, she minded terribly. The music swelled again, filling the hall with a bright, cheerful melody that felt entirely wrong for the moment. Charlotte watched the dancers moving in their perfect lines, watched the candlelight flicker gold across silk gowns and polished shoes, and felt, as she often did at these events, like a portrait hung slightly crooked on someone else's wall, present, visible, but never quite belonging. She thought of her father, waiting at home with his ledgers and his worried frown, hoping against hope that tonight might bring some news of a match that could ease the family's troubles. She thought of her mother, circling the edges of the ballroom even now, searching for any gentleman who might overlook a modest dowry for the sake of good breeding and a pleasant face. She thought of Henry Ashford, though she tried very hard never to think of Henry Ashford, and felt the old, familiar ache rise in her chest before she pushed it firmly back down. 5 years. It had been 5 years since he had left her standing at the church, since the whispers had first begun, since her name had become something whispered rather than spoken plainly. 5 years of balls just like this one, of mockery just like this one, of standing at the edges of rooms while other women found their happiness in the center of them. She was tired. She would not have admitted it aloud, not even to Lucy, but she was so very tired. "Charlotte," Lucy's voice pulled her back to the present, and something in her friend's tone made Charlotte open her eyes and look up. "Something is happening." Charlotte followed her friend's gaze toward the entrance of the ballroom, where the crowd had begun to part in a manner that could only mean one thing. A hush moved through the room like a wave, conversation after conversation dying away, as heads turned toward the tall double doors. And there, framed in the golden light of the entrance hall, stood a man Charlotte had never seen before, though she understood at once, from the way the entire room seemed to bend itself around him, exactly who he must be. He was tall, with the kind of stillness that came from absolute self-possession, dressed in black that made every other color in the room seem suddenly too bright, too eager. His face was handsome in a severe way, all sharp lines and unreadable expression, and his eyes swept across the ballroom with the detached interest of a man surveying a room he had no real desire to enter. The Duke of Rothmere had arrived, and the entire ballroom had gone still to receive him. Charlotte felt, for reasons she could not quite explain, a small and unfamiliar flutter somewhere beneath her ribs. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself it was simply the natural reaction anyone might have to the arrival of someone so powerful, so watched, so entirely unlike anyone else in the room. She had no way of knowing, as she stood there at the edge of the dance floor with her lemonade slowly warming in her hand, that his cold gray eyes would soon find her among the crowd, and that when they did, nothing in her carefully ordered life would ever be quite the same again. For now, she simply watched, along with everyone else, as the Duke of Rothmere stepped into the ballroom, and the whispers that had followed her all evening finally found something new to talk about. She thought that was the end of it. She thought she could return to the safety of the shadows, to Lucy's quiet company, to the familiar ache of being overlooked. She did not yet understand that the storm she had felt approaching was not going to pass her by. It was coming directly for her, and it would not stop until it had rearranged the entire room around her, whether she wished it to or not. The Duke moved through the crowd the way a ship moves through still water, leaving a wake of bows and curtsies and whispered introductions behind him. Charlotte watched from a safe distance as his aunt, Lady Ashcombe, guided him from one small cluster of guests to another, presenting him like a prize to be admired rather than a man to be known. "He has not smiled once," Lucy murmured, standing close beside Charlotte with her lemonade forgotten in her hand. "Not even for Lady Ashcombe's own daughters, and they are said to be the prettiest girls in 3 counties this season." "Perhaps he does not find pretty faces particularly interesting," Charlotte said. "Powerful men rarely need to work hard for attention. Perhaps that makes them harder to impress. Or perhaps he simply has no heart at all, as everyone says." Charlotte did not answer. She had heard the rumors about the Duke of Rothmere long before tonight, that he had built his fortune through ruthless business decisions that had ruined lesser men, that he had inherited his title young and cold, that he had never once been seen showing warmth toward anyone outside his small circle of trusted associates. She had no reason to doubt any of it. Men like that did not become powerful by being gentle. She turned her attention away from the entrance and back, toward the safety of her own small corner of the room, hoping that whatever excitement his arrival had caused would settle quickly enough that she could return to being invisible again. Invisibility, she had learned, was its own kind of safety. It did not last. "Charlotte," her mother's voice arrived before her mother did, tight with the particular urgency she reserved for matters of great importance. Margaret Hale appeared at her daughter's side in a rustle of pale blue silk, her face flushed with the effort of crossing the crowded room quickly. "Charlotte, you must come with me at once." "Mother, whatever is the matter?" "Lady Ashcombe has just informed me that the Duke of Rothmere is looking for a wife this season. His aunt has apparently despaired of him remaining unmarried any longer, and has taken matters into her own hands." Margaret's eyes were bright with a hope that made Charlotte's stomach tighten uncomfortably. "This is precisely the sort of opportunity we have been waiting for." "Mother, a duke does not marry a woman with no dowry to speak of, and a broken engagement behind her. You do not know that. Stranger matches have happened, and your father's situation grows more difficult by the month, Charlotte. You know this as well as I do." Charlotte felt the familiar weight settle onto her shoulders, the weight she had carried for 5 years now, ever since her father's investments had begun to falter, and her family's modest fortune had started slipping quietly away. She was the eldest daughter. She understood, in the way that women of her position always understood, that her marriage, or the lack of one, was not simply a private matter but a question that touched the entire family's future. "I am not asking you to throw yourself at him," Margaret continued, lowering her voice as though the very walls might be listening. "I am only asking you to be visible, stand where he might see you, smile if the opportunity presents itself. That is all. And if it does not present itself, then we have lost nothing, but an evening we would have spent standing here regardless." Charlotte wanted to argue, wanted to explain that she had spent 5 years being visible, being polite, being everything a proper young woman was supposed to be, and that none of it had ever once produced the miracle her mother seemed to believe was always just around the next corner. But she had learned, over those same 5 years, that arguing with her mother's hope was like arguing with weather. It simply continued regardless of what anyone said. "I will do my best, Mother," she said instead, because it was easier, and because some small, stubborn part of her still wanted to believe that trying might someday be enough. Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand, relief plain on her face, and hurried off to find Charlotte's father among the card tables, no doubt to share the fragile hope she had constructed out of nothing more than a rumor and a Duke's tired expression. Lucy watched the whole exchange with a small frown. "Your mother means well. I know. But it does grow tiresome, does it not? Being treated as though your entire worth depends on whether some man decides to notice you." Charlotte let out a long breath. "I have stopped expecting it to be otherwise. It is simply the way of things." "It should not be the way of things." "No," Charlotte agreed quietly, "it should not. But wishing it were different has never once changed it." Before Lucy could respond, a familiar and unwelcome voice cut through their conversation. "Miss Hale, how lovely to see you here again this season." Beatrice Lowell approached with two of her usual companions trailing behind her like ladies-in-waiting, her smile bright and sharp as a blade catching sunlight. Beatrice was a distant cousin of Charlotte's, though the two had never been close, and had grown considerably less close in the years since Charlotte's broken engagement had given Beatrice an endless supply of material for her particular brand of cruelty. "I do admire your persistence. Most women would have given up attending these events by now." "Why would I give up something I enjoy, Beatrice?" "Oh, do you enjoy it?" "I only ask because you always seem to be standing so very far from the dancing." Beatrice's gaze flicked meaningfully toward the empty space around Charlotte's feet, as though checking to confirm that no gentleman had dared to stand near her. "One might almost think the gentlemen were avoiding you. One might also think you had nothing better to occupy your evening than counting the space around other people," Lucy said sharply, stepping forward before Charlotte could respond. Beatrice's smile did not waver, though something flickered briefly behind her eyes. "I only speak out of concern, Miss Bennet. It cannot be easy for the family watching Charlotte grow older each season without any prospects. I imagine her poor mother must be quite worried, especially now, given the family's difficulties." The word difficulties hung in the air like a small, deliberate cruelty, a reference to her father's financial troubles that everyone in the room seemed to know about despite the family's best efforts at discretion. Charlotte felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she forced herself to keep her expression calm. "My family's difficulties, as you call them, are not your concern, Beatrice." "Of course not. I only mention it because I do care about you in my own way. We are family, after all, however distant." Beatrice's eyes swept over Charlotte's gown, lingering just long enough to make clear she had noticed it was 2 seasons out of fashion. "I only hope that whatever gentleman does eventually consider you will not mind the circumstances. Some men are quite particular about such things." "And some men," said a voice behind them, low and cool and utterly unfamiliar, "find themselves far more concerned with the character of the women speaking than the circumstances of the woman being spoken about." The entire group turned as one. The Duke of Rothmere stood only a few feet away, having apparently approached without any of them noticing, his gray eyes moving over Beatrice with an expression that could have frozen the entire ballroom solid. He had not raised his voice. He had not needed to. Something in his tone had carried anyway, cutting through the surrounding noise with the precision of a man accustomed to being heard exactly as loudly as he intended. Beatrice's face went through several rapid changes: surprise, alarm, and finally a strained attempt at composure. "Your Grace, I did not realize you were nearby." "Evidently not," the Duke said, "or you might have chosen your conversation more carefully." Charlotte stood frozen, her heart beating strangely fast, uncertain whether to feel grateful or mortified that this exchange was happening at all, and utterly uncertain why a man who had never met her would trouble himself to intervene on her behalf. Beatrice recovered quickly, offering the Duke a bright, practiced smile. "I assure you, Your Grace, I meant nothing unkind. Miss Hale and I are old friends. We speak plainly with one another, as family does." "Family," the Duke repeated, his tone making the single word sound almost like an accusation. His gaze shifted, finally, to Charlotte, and she felt the full weight of his attention land on her like something physical. For a moment, neither of them said anything at all. Up close, he was even more severe than he had appeared from across the room, his features sharp and controlled, his eyes a shade of gray that reminded Charlotte of storm clouds gathered over water. There was nothing warm in his expression, nothing that suggested kindness or softness of any kind, and yet something in the directness of his gaze made her feel, for the first time all evening, as though she were actually being seen rather than simply observed and dismissed. "Miss Hale," he said, and it was not a question. "Yes, Your Grace." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I understand you have not yet danced this evening." The words seemed to hang in the air, and Charlotte was suddenly, painfully aware of every eye in their immediate vicinity turning toward them, of the whispers already beginning to rustle through the surrounding guests like wind through dry leaves. "I have not, Your Grace." "Then perhaps," he said, extending one gloved hand toward her with the calm certainty of a man who had never once been refused anything in his entire life, "you might allow me to correct that oversight." Behind her, Charlotte heard Beatrice's sharp intake of breath, heard her mother's small gasp from somewhere across the room, heard the low murmur of surprised voices beginning to spread outward like ripples on a still pond. She looked at the Duke's outstretched hand, then at his unreadable face, and felt the strange, dizzying sensation of standing at the very edge of something enormous, something that would change the shape of the evening entirely, whether she was ready for it or not. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "I am not certain that is wise." Something flickered in his gray eyes, not quite amusement, but something close to it. "I did not ask if it was wise, Miss Hale. I asked if you would dance with me." The orchestra, as though sensing the moment required accompaniment, began a new song, the opening notes rising gently through the sudden hush that had fallen over the surrounding guests. Charlotte looked past the Duke's shoulder, at Beatrice's stunned expression, at Lucy's wide and delighted eyes, at the sea of faces that had, only moments ago, been whispering about her failures, and were now watching her with an entirely different kind of attention. She thought of her mother's hopeful words. She thought of 5 years of standing at the edges of rooms. She thought of the particular courage it took to accept an invitation that might, for all she knew, simply be another kind of cruelty dressed in fine clothing. And then slowly, she placed her hand in his. "Very well, Your Grace," she said, "I would be honored." The ballroom, which had already gone quiet once that evening for his arrival, went quiet again, this time entirely because of her. His hand was warm through the thin fabric of her glove, steady in a way that felt strangely reassuring as he led her toward the center of the floor. Charlotte was aware of every pair of eyes following them, aware of the low hum of whispered speculation rising behind them like smoke from a freshly lit fire, aware most of all of the strange unreality of the moment, as though she had somehow stepped outside her own life and was now watching it happen to someone else. "You are trembling," the Duke observed quietly, as they took their places among the other couples. "I am not accustomed to being watched quite so closely, Your Grace." "You were being watched closely before I arrived. I simply changed what they were watching for." Charlotte glanced up at him, surprised by the observation. "That is a rather blunt way of putting it." "I find bluntness saves a great deal of time." His hand settled at her waist as the music began in earnest, and they moved together into the first steps of the dance with a smoothness that suggested he was as capable on a dance floor as he apparently was in every other arena of his life. "You strike me as a woman who prefers honesty to flattery, Miss Hale. Am I mistaken?" "You are not mistaken, though I confess I did not expect a duke to concern himself with what a woman prefers. Most dukes do not. I find most conversations at events like these to be an elaborate performance in which everyone pretends to enjoy themselves considerably more than they actually do." He turned her smoothly beneath the chandelier light, and for a moment the golden glow caught the sharp planes of his face, softening them slightly. "I did not come here tonight to perform, Miss Hale. I came because my aunt threatened to involve herself in my affairs in ways I would find considerably more tedious than a single evening of dancing." "How romantic," Charlotte said dryly before she could stop herself. Something shifted in his expression, the faintest suggestion of amusement, gone almost before she could be certain she had seen it at all. "I did not claim romance was my intention. I claim only honesty." "Then allow me to be equally honest, Your Grace. I do not know why you chose to dance with me instead of any other woman in this room, and I confess it makes me uneasy. Kindness offered without explanation tends to arrive with a cost attached, in my experience." The Duke was quiet for a moment, his gray eyes studying her with an intensity that made Charlotte feel as though he were reading something written directly across her face. "That is a rather cynical view for someone so young." "I am not so young as you might think, Your Grace. And I have had considerable practice in learning which kindnesses come with costs and which do not." "Then let me remove your uncertainty entirely." His voice dropped slightly, low enough that only she could hear it over the surrounding music. "I danced with you because I watched a woman speak to you with deliberate cruelty in a room full of people who said nothing, and I found that I did not care for the silence nearly as much as I found myself caring for how you bore it. That is the whole of my reasoning. There is no cost attached." Charlotte's breath caught slightly, and she was grateful for the steady rhythm of the dance, which gave her something to focus on besides the sudden warmth spreading through her chest. She did not know what to make of him, this cold, powerful man who spoke with such unexpected directness, who seemed to see straight through the careful composure she had spent years perfecting. "You are very unlike your reputation, Your Grace." "And what is my reputation precisely?" "That you are ruthless, that you have no patience for weakness or sentiment, that you have built your fortune by ruining anyone foolish enough to stand in your way." "All of that is true," he said, without hesitation, without apology. "I have been ruthless when ruthlessness was required. I have shown no patience for men who mistake kindness for weakness and attempt to exploit it. I have ruined those who deserved ruin, and I have never once regretted it." That does not sound like the man who just defended a stranger against unkind words. "Perhaps," he said, "it is simply that I recognize cruelty when I see it in whatever form it takes, and I have never had much patience for it, regardless of who commits it or against whom it is aimed." His gaze held hers, steady and unflinching. "You are not a stranger to me now, Miss Hale. You are a woman I watched be humiliated by people who should have known better. That is reason enough." The dance continued, weaving them through the other couples, and Charlotte found herself, against every instinct of caution she possessed, beginning to relax slightly in his hold. There was something oddly grounding about his directness, about the complete absence of flattery or performance in the way he spoke to her. She had spent so many years navigating conversations built entirely on things left unsaid that his plain honesty felt almost like stepping into cool water after too long in the heat. "May I ask you something, Your Grace?" "You may ask. I make no promise of an answer." "Why does it trouble you so much, seeing someone treated unkindly? Most men in your position would not have noticed at all, let alone intervened." For a long moment, he said nothing, and Charlotte thought perhaps she had pressed too far, had asked a question that would close the brief window of honesty that had opened between them. But then his expression shifted, something passing behind his eyes that looked almost like an old, carefully buried pain. "I know what it is to be spoken about in rooms full of people who believe you cannot hear them, or do not care whether you do," he said finally, his voice quieter than before. I know what it is to have your circumstances discussed as though they were public entertainment rather than private grief. I did not enjoy it, Miss Hale, and I have little patience for watching it happen to anyone else." Charlotte wanted to ask more, wanted to understand what experience could have shaped a duke into a man who understood humiliation so intimately. But something in his expression told her the door had closed again, sealed as quickly as it had opened. "I am sorry," she said instead, simply, "for whatever you endured that taught you this." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, that she had chosen sympathy rather than curiosity. "That is not the response I expected." "What response did you expect?" "Questions? Everyone always wants the details, Miss Hale. The particular shape of the wound, so they might examine it properly." "I have no interest in examining your wounds, Your Grace. I have enough of my own to occupy me." The corner of his mouth lifted, the smallest hint of a genuine smile breaking through his carefully composed features, for just a moment before vanishing again. "Now that," he said, "is the most honest thing anyone has said to me all season." The music built toward its final movement, and as the dance drew to its close, the Duke bowed over her hand with a formality that felt, somehow, warmer than any embrace she had received from another suitor in years. Applause rippled politely through the room, though Charlotte could feel the weight of 100 curious stares pressing in from every direction, could hear the low buzz of speculation already spreading like fire through dry grass. "Thank you for the dance, Miss Hale," the Duke said, straightening. "I hope it was not too great a trial." "It was not a trial at all, Your Grace." She found, to her own surprise, that she meant it entirely. He studied her for a moment longer, something unreadable passing behind his gray eyes, and then he inclined his head slightly. "Then perhaps we shall have occasion to dance again." Before she could respond, he had turned and moved back through the crowd, leaving Charlotte standing alone at the center of the ballroom floor, acutely aware that every single person in the room was now watching her with an entirely different expression than they had worn only 20 minutes before. Lucy appeared at her side almost instantly, practically vibrating with barely contained excitement. "Charlotte. Charlotte, do you have any idea what just happened?" "I believe I was there for it, Lucy." "The Duke of Rothermere, who has not danced with a single woman in London in 3 years, according to everyone I have ever spoken to, just danced with you, in front of the entire room, immediately after defending you against Beatrice Lowell's tongue." Lucy's eyes were wide with delight. "You have become, in the space of one dance, the single most talked about woman in this entire ballroom." Charlotte glanced across the room and found her mother watching her with an expression of such stunned, hopeful joy that it made her chest ache. She found Beatrice standing rigid near the refreshment table, her earlier smugness replaced by something far more sour. And she found, near the far wall, the Duke himself, already deep in conversation with another gentleman, though his gray eyes flicked briefly toward her before returning to his companion. "I do not know what to make of any of this," Charlotte admitted quietly. "I do not think you are meant to make anything of it yet," Lucy said, looping her arm through Charlotte's. "I think you are simply meant to enjoy it, for once, instead of bracing yourself for whatever unkindness usually follows a good moment." Charlotte let out a slow breath, feeling the truth of her friend's words settle somewhere deep inside her chest. For 5 years, every good moment in her life had been followed swiftly by something designed to remind her of her place. A whispered comment, a pitying glance, a reminder that she had failed at the one thing society believed a woman was meant to accomplish. But tonight, standing in the golden light of Ashcombe House, with the echo of the Duke's steady voice still warm in her ears, Charlotte allowed herself, just for a moment, to believe that perhaps this time would be different. She did not yet know how wrong and how right that hope would prove to be. News of the dance traveled faster than Charlotte could have imagined possible. By the time her family's carriage rolled to a stop outside their modest townhouse late that night, her mother had already begun composing, aloud and at considerable length, the letter she intended to send to her sister in Bath describing the evening's events in the most favorable possible light. The Duke of Rothermere, Charlotte, the Duke himself, choosing you above every other woman in that room. Margaret pressed a hand to her chest as though she might faint from the sheer weight of her own happiness. I confess I hardly know what to do with myself. Mother, please, it was a single dance. It does not mean anything beyond that. A single dance with a man who has not danced with anyone in 3 years means a great deal indeed, whatever you might wish to believe. Margaret turned to her husband, who sat quietly across from them in the carriage, his expression thoughtful rather than celebratory. Richard, say something. Your daughter is trying to convince herself that nothing of consequence has happened. Richard Hale studied his daughter for a long moment before speaking, his voice carrying the careful weight of a man who had spent years watching his family's fortunes rise and fall with the changing tides of business. I will say only this, Charlotte. Whatever the Duke's intentions, you conducted yourself tonight with more grace than that entire ballroom deserved. Whatever comes of this, I am proud of you for that alone. Charlotte felt tears prick unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, grateful for her father's quiet steadiness amid her mother's excited chatter. Thank you, father. That said, he added, with the faint trace of a smile, your mother is not entirely wrong to hope. Men in the Duke's position do not offer such gestures lightly, whatever his reasons. Charlotte said nothing further, though she found herself turning the evening over in her mind long after she had retired to her room, long after the house had gone quiet and dark around her. She thought of the Duke's steady gray eyes, of the strange honesty in his voice when he had spoken of understanding humiliation, of the brief, unguarded smile that had crossed his face before he composed himself once more. She told herself firmly that it meant nothing, that men of his rank often performed small kindnesses for reasons that had little to do with genuine feeling, and everything to do with pride or boredom or some private calculation she could not begin to guess. But some small, stubborn part of her heart refused entirely to listen. The following days brought a flood of consequences Charlotte had not anticipated. Invitations that had once arrived only rarely now appeared with unusual frequency. Women who had barely acknowledged her presence at previous events suddenly found reasons to strike up conversation whenever they encountered her in the park or at the milliner's shop. Even Beatrice Lowell, though clearly still simmering with resentment, had begun greeting Charlotte with a stiff, uneasy politeness that suggested she no longer felt quite so confident of her position. It is remarkable, Lucy observed, as the two of them walked together through the park one bright afternoon, how quickly people rearrange their opinions when a duke rearranges his attention. It is not remarkable at all. It is simply predictable, Charlotte replied, though there was less bitterness in her voice than there might have been a week earlier. People value whatever the powerful value. It has always been so, and I suspect it always will be. Does it not bother you, though, that the very same women who mocked you cruelly now smile at you as though nothing happened at all? Charlotte considered the question seriously before answering. It bothers me less than I expected. I have spent 5 years wishing they would simply leave me be. If their sudden kindness means fewer cruel words directed my way, I find I cannot entirely resent it, however hollow its origins might be. They had barely finished their loop of the park when a familiar figure appeared on the path ahead, and Charlotte felt her stomach drop unpleasantly at the sight of him. Henry Ashford had not changed much in 5 years, still handsome in the easy, careless way that had once made her foolish young heart flutter, still possessed of the same charming smile that had convinced her, once, that she was loved. He approached now with that same smile fixed firmly in place, as though the years and the humiliation he had caused her had simply never happened at all. Charlotte, what a pleasant surprise. Mr. Ashford. Her voice came out cooler than she intended, though not nearly as cold as she felt inside. I did not know you had returned to London. Only recently, business matters mostly. His eyes moved over her with an assessing quality that made her skin crawl slightly. I heard rather interesting news at my club this morning. Something about a certain duke taking a particular interest in you at Lady Ashcombe's ball. I fail to see how that concerns you, Mr. Ashford. It does not concern me at all, of course. I merely find it curious. He smiled, a smile that had once seemed warm and now struck her as calculating in a way she had somehow failed to notice 5 years earlier. "I always did think you deserved better than the life you were left with after our unfortunate misunderstanding." Charlotte's jaw tightened. "There was no misunderstanding, Mr. Ashford. You left me standing at the church while you married a woman with a considerably larger fortune. I would appreciate it if you would not attempt to rewrite history in the middle of a public park." Lucy, standing beside her, had gone rigid with barely contained fury, but Charlotte placed a steadying hand on her friend's arm, silently urging patience. Henry's smile faltered slightly, though he recovered it quickly. "I only meant to say that I am glad to see fortune finally smiling on you, whatever the circumstances of our past. Perhaps, given this new attention, we might speak again sometime, as old friends." "We were never friends, Mr. Ashford. We were engaged, and then we were nothing, and I intend for us to remain nothing for the rest of our acquaintance." Charlotte straightened her shoulders, drawing on the same composure that had carried her through countless humiliating evenings. "Good day." She turned and walked away before he could respond, Lucy hurrying to catch up beside her, and did not look back, though she could feel his gaze following her the entire length of the path. "What a repulsive man," Lucy muttered once they were safely out of earshot. "How dare he speak to you as though nothing happened, as though he did not ruin your reputation for his own gain? He has always believed the world exists primarily to accommodate his own comfort," Charlotte said, her voice steadier than her racing heart. "I suppose 5 years has done nothing to change that particular belief. Do you think he truly intends to pursue some renewed acquaintance now that the Duke has shown you favor?" Charlotte considered the question, an uneasy feeling settling in her stomach. "I think Henry Ashford has always been drawn to whatever appears valuable to other people. If the Duke's attention has made me suddenly interesting in society's eyes, I would not be surprised if Henry decided I had become interesting to him again as well." "That is a rather cynical view." "It is an accurate one, unfortunately. I learned that particular lesson the hard way." Charlotte glanced back once briefly, toward the path where Henry had stood, and found him still watching her from a distance, his expression thoughtful in a way that made her distinctly uneasy. "I only hope he does not intend to make a nuisance of himself." She could not have known, as they walked on together beneath the bright afternoon sun, just how accurate that fear would prove to be, nor how deeply Henry Ashford's wounded pride would come to entangle itself with everything that followed. That same afternoon, back at the townhouse, a note arrived that set the entire household into a fresh flurry of excitement. It came on heavy cream paper, sealed with a crest Charlotte did not immediately recognize, and addressed in a firm, confident hand directly to her. Her mother very nearly wrestled it from the footman's hands before Charlotte could open it herself. "Well, well, Charlotte, do not simply stand there, open it at once." Charlotte broke the seal with fingers that trembled slightly more than she would have liked to admit, and unfolded the single page within. "Miss Hale, I find myself, against my better judgment, curious to continue a conversation that was cut too short by the constraints of a crowded ballroom. If you are amenable, I would be glad to call upon you and your family this Thursday afternoon, should it be convenient. I make no promises regarding my ability to be charming. I offer only honesty, which I hope, given our previous conversation, you might find an acceptable substitute. Nathaniel Ashcombe, Duke of Rothmere." Charlotte read the note twice, then a third time, feeling something warm and unfamiliar unfurl slowly in her chest despite every instinct urging her toward caution. "Well," her mother demanded again, practically trembling with anticipation, "what does it say?" Charlotte looked up, and found she could not entirely suppress the small smile that had crept onto her own face. "It seems, Mother, that the Duke intends to call upon us Thursday." Her mother's answering shriek of delight was loud enough to bring both her father and the household staff hurrying into the room, and Charlotte, despite every careful warning she had given herself, found she could not entirely regret the cause of it. Thursday arrived with a nervous energy that seemed to have infected the entire household. Margaret Hale had insisted on having the good china brought out of storage, had rearranged the sitting room furniture no fewer than 3 times, and had spent the better part of the morning fussing over which gown Charlotte ought to wear, despite Charlotte's repeated insistence that the Duke had already seen her in far grander attire, and was unlikely to be swayed one way or another by an afternoon dress. "You cannot simply wear something plain, Charlotte. This is a Duke we are receiving. He is a man who has already witnessed me humiliated in public, and danced with me anyway, Mother. I do not believe my choice of afternoon dress will make or break his opinion of me." Despite her protests, Charlotte found her own hands were not entirely steady as she smoothed the front of the pale green gown she had finally settled on, nor was her heart entirely calm as she waited in the sitting room, listening for the sound of an approaching carriage. When the Duke arrived, precisely on the hour, he seemed, if anything, slightly out of place amid the modest comfort of their sitting room. Too tall, too severe, too accustomed to grander surroundings. And yet he bowed to Margaret and Richard Hale with perfect courtesy, accepted a cup of tea he did not particularly seem to want, and endured a full quarter-hour of Margaret's nervous chatter with a patience that surprised Charlotte considerably. "Perhaps," he said finally, when a brief lull opened in Margaret's conversation, "Miss Hale might show me the garden. I understand your family keeps a rather fine one." Margaret's eyes lit with such transparent delight that Charlotte nearly winced. "Of course, your Grace, of course. Charlotte, do show his Grace the roses." The garden, in truth, was modest, a small square of green tucked behind the townhouse, kept tidy by Charlotte's own hands more often than not, since they could no longer afford the gardener her family had once employed. But it was peaceful and private, and Charlotte found herself grateful for the escape from her mother's watchful, hopeful eyes. "Your mother is a formidable woman," the Duke observed, as they walked slowly along the narrow garden path. "She means well. She has simply invested a great deal of hope in this particular afternoon, and I fear she has not learned to disguise it." "There is no shame in hope, however visible." Charlotte glanced up at him, surprised by the gentleness in his tone. "That is a rather generous sentiment for a man with your reputation, your Grace." "My reputation is built on my conduct in matters of business, Miss Hale, not on my capacity for kindness in matters that actually concern me." He paused beside a small rose bush, examining it with the careful attention of a man who found genuine interest in small, ordinary things. "You seem determined to remind me of my reputation at every opportunity. I find it easier to guard myself against disappointment if I keep expecting the version of you that everyone warns me about." "And which version have you encountered thus far?" Charlotte considered the question honestly. "Neither, entirely. You are not the cold, ruthless man of the rumors, nor are you the sort of easy charmer I have learned to distrust. You are something else. I confess I have not yet decided what." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes fixed on the rosebush rather than on her. "I was not always as I am now," he said finally, his voice lower, more careful than she had yet heard it. "I inherited my title at 22 when my father died rather suddenly and left the estate in considerable disorder. I spent the years that followed learning, often painfully, that kindness offered too freely invited exploitation from every direction. Men I had considered friends attempted to swindle me the moment they believed grief had made me vulnerable. Women I had considered attachments revealed themselves to be interested only in the title, not the man beneath it." He glanced at her briefly. "I built the reputation you have heard of quite deliberately, Miss Hale. It has served me well, in protecting what little of myself I still wish to keep private." "That sounds terribly lonely." "It has been," he admitted, with a candor that seemed to surprise even himself. "Though I had grown accustomed to considering it a fair trade, loneliness at least does not betray you." Charlotte felt something twist gently in her chest at the quiet ache beneath his words. "I understand that feeling better than you might expect, Your Grace." "Tell me." It was not quite a question, and yet something in the directness of his request made Charlotte want to answer honestly, in a way she rarely allowed herself with anyone beyond Lucy. "I was engaged once," she said slowly. "5 years ago to a man named Henry Ashford. We were to be married in the spring. I had already chosen my gown, already accepted the congratulations of half of London, already begun imagining the whole of my future beside him." She paused, steadying her voice against the old, familiar ache. "He left me standing at the church on our wedding day and married a woman with a considerably larger fortune instead, within the same month. I have spent every season since then being reminded, in one way or another, of my failure to secure what every woman is apparently meant to secure." "That was not your failure," the Duke said, his voice hardening slightly. "That was his cowardice. I know that, in the part of my mind that reasons clearly. But 5 years of whispered judgment has a way of settling into places reason cannot always reach." She looked up at him, surprised by her own honesty. "I have grown rather skilled at appearing unaffected, Your Grace. I do not know that I have ever fully succeeded at actually being unaffected." The Duke studied her for a long moment, something unguarded moving behind his gray eyes. "I find that admission considerably more impressive than any performance of unaffected composure could have been." "Why?" "Because composure is easily learned, Miss Hale. Honesty about one's wounds is not." They walked on in comfortable silence for a while, the late afternoon sun slanting warm and golden through the garden, and Charlotte found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely unafraid of the silence between herself and another person. There was no need to fill it with careful words, no need to perform contentment she did not feel. "May I ask you something rather forward, Your Grace?" "You may." "Why did you truly ask to call on my family? You could have satisfied whatever curiosity our dance created with a single conversation, and moved on to whatever else occupies a duke's attention. Instead, you have sat through my mother's nervous chatter and walked through my modest garden, and I confess, I still do not entirely understand your purpose in doing either." The Duke stopped walking, turning to face her fully, his expression more open than she had yet seen it. "I find, Miss Hale, that I have spent a great many years surrounding myself with people who wanted something from me, my title, my fortune, my influence. I have grown rather tired of it. You are the first person in a very long while who has looked at me and seen, apparently, nothing worth wanting at all, beyond honest conversation." A faint, almost rueful smile touched his mouth. "I find that considerably more valuable than I expected to." Charlotte felt heat rise in her cheeks, unable to entirely disguise how deeply his words had affected her. "I would not say there is nothing worth wanting, Your Grace." "No." "No," she said, softer than she intended. "I simply had not allowed myself to consider that a duke might be worth wanting for reasons beyond his title." Something shifted in his expression, warm and startled all at once, as though her words had caught him entirely off guard. For a long moment neither of them spoke, the golden afternoon light settling quietly around them, the distant sound of the city fading into something that felt briefly like the only two people in the world. Charlotte, her name, spoken for the first time without her title attached, sent an unexpected warmth curling through her chest. "I would like, if you are willing, to continue this acquaintance beyond a single afternoon's visit. I make no promises of what it might become. I only know that I find myself, for the first time in a great many years, genuinely reluctant to leave a conversation." "I would like that as well, Your Grace." "Nathaniel," he corrected gently. "If we are to continue this acquaintance honestly, I would prefer you use my given name, at least when we are private." "Nathaniel, then." The name felt strange and warm on her tongue, unfamiliar in a way that made her heart beat unsteadily. "I would like that as well." Neither of them noticed, in that quiet golden moment, the figure watching from the narrow gap in the garden wall that separated the Hale property from the lane beyond, Beatrice Lowell, who had claimed some errand in the neighborhood that afternoon entirely by design, and who watched the Duke of Rothmere speak Charlotte Hale's given name with an expression of such cold, calculating fury that it might have frozen the golden afternoon solid, had either of them turned to see it. Beatrice had spent 5 years enjoying her position as the more fortunate cousin, the one who had never suffered public humiliation, the one whose engagement had proceeded exactly as planned to a respectable, if unremarkable, gentleman 2 seasons past. She had never imagined that Charlotte Hale, quiet, overlooked Charlotte, whom she had mocked so freely and so often, might rise to a position that made Beatrice's own accomplishments seem suddenly, painfully small. She turned from the gap in the wall with her jaw set, and her mind already turning toward the particular kind of scheming she had always found herself skilled at, and made her way back toward the lane with the deliberate steps of a woman already planning her next move. Charlotte, still standing in the warm, golden light of her own garden with Nathaniel's steady gaze fixed upon her, had no notion at all of the storm quietly gathering beyond the wall, nor any idea how soon it would arrive to test everything that had begun, so fragile and so unexpected, in that quiet afternoon hour. Beatrice Lowell did not waste time once her mind was set upon a course of action. Within 2 days of witnessing that quiet moment in the Hale family garden, she had arranged to encounter Henry Ashford at a small gathering hosted by a mutual acquaintance, and had steered their conversation, with practiced skill, toward the very subject she wished to discuss. "I confess I was rather surprised to see you return to London, Mr. Ashford," she said, settling beside him with a glass of wine and an expression of polite curiosity. "I understand you have taken quite an interest in your former fiancé's recent good fortune." Henry's easy smile flickered, just slightly. "I would not call it an interest so much as simple observation. It is difficult not to notice when someone of the Duke's stature suddenly begins courting a woman he would never previously have considered." "Difficult indeed," Beatrice agreed, her tone carefully neutral. "Though I confess, Mr. Ashford, I find myself wondering what precisely Charlotte hopes to gain from this sudden attention, beyond the obvious advantages to her family's rather precarious finances." Henry's expression sharpened with interest. "You believe her motives are financial?" "I believe," Beatrice said carefully, "that a woman whose family stands on the edge of ruin and who has spent 5 years failing to secure any respectable match might find herself rather motivated to pursue a duke's fortune by whatever means necessary. Do you not agree?" I had not considered it in quite those terms. Henry's eyes had taken on a calculating gleam that mirrored Beatrice's own. "Though I confess, having known Charlotte rather intimately once, I would not put such calculation entirely past her." The bitterness in his voice was unmistakable, and Beatrice recognized it immediately for what it was: the wounded pride of a man who had discarded something and only now, watching another man value it, begun to regret the discarding. She filed the observation away carefully, understanding at once how useful his particular resentment might prove. "It seems a pity," she said slowly, "that no one has thought to warn the Duke of her family's true circumstances, nor of the particular reasons behind her broken engagement. I understand there were rather scandalous details that never became widely known." Henry's jaw tightened. "There is nothing scandalous in the details, only my own decision to seek a more advantageous match." "Of course," Beatrice said smoothly, though her eyes glittered with a satisfaction she did not bother entirely to hide. "Though I imagine, if certain details were to reach the Duke's ears, details suggesting Charlotte's family had, perhaps, attempted to trap you into marriage through less than honest means, or that Charlotte herself had shown a rather troubling willingness to pursue any man of fortune, regardless of affection, the Duke's own family might grow considerably more cautious about the match." "Are you suggesting we should invent such details, Miss Lowell?" "I am suggesting nothing so crude as invention," Beatrice said, her smile thin and sharp. "I am simply observing that the truth, told with the right emphasis and to the right people, has a remarkable capacity to shape opinion however one wishes it shaped. Charlotte's family does face financial difficulty. She has pursued several unsuccessful matches over the years. You yourself ended your engagement rather abruptly, and I imagine you have never fully explained your reasons to anyone beyond your own circle. It would require very little effort to encourage certain assumptions among the right listeners." Henry considered this for a long moment, old resentment and fresh jealousy warring visibly behind his eyes. He had, in truth, felt a peculiar sourness settle in his stomach, since learning of the Duke's attention toward Charlotte. Not because he wished to reclaim her for himself, precisely, but because he could not bear the thought that the woman he had so carelessly discarded might rise to a position considerably grander than the one he had chosen instead. "What precisely do you propose, Miss Lowell?" Beatrice leaned closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial murmur. "I propose only that certain conversations occur in certain drawing rooms among certain influential ladies who happen to have the Duke's aunt's ear. Nothing so crude as an accusation. Only concern. Gentle, well-meaning concern about whether Charlotte Hale's sudden good fortune might be built on rather more calculation than affection." Henry's smile returned slowly, cold and calculating in a way that would have chilled Charlotte to see, had she been present. "You are a resourceful woman, Miss Lowell." "I am simply a woman who dislikes watching undeserving people rise above their proper station," Beatrice replied, raising her glass slightly in a private, cruel toast. "I do hope you will assist me in correcting that particular error." Neither of them noticed, or particularly cared, the quiet damage such conversations would soon inflict, not merely upon Charlotte's reputation, but upon the fragile, honest connection that had only just begun to grow between two people who had each, in their own way, spent years guarding themselves against exactly this kind of calculated cruelty. Within a week, the whispers had begun. Charlotte first noticed the change during a visit to Lady Ashcombe's afternoon tea, an invitation she had received with considerable surprise, given her limited previous acquaintance with the Duke's aunt. The older woman received her with polite warmth, but Charlotte could sense, beneath the surface courtesy, a new and careful watchfulness that had not been present during their brief encounter at the ball. "My nephew speaks of you rather often, Miss Hale," Lady Ashcombe observed, pouring tea with hands that were steady but eyes that studied Charlotte with unusual intensity. "It is not like him to speak so freely of anyone." "I am glad to hear it, Lady Ashcombe, though I confess I do not entirely know what to make of it myself." "No," the older woman said slowly, "I imagine you do not." She set down the teapot with deliberate care. "Forgive my bluntness, Miss Hale, but I have heard certain things recently that trouble me, concerning your family's financial circumstances. Concerning the nature of your previous engagement." Charlotte felt a cold unease settle in her stomach. "What precisely have you heard, Lady Ashcombe?" "That your family stands on the edge of financial ruin, and has done for some years. That your previous engagement ended not through any fault of Mr. Ashford's, as has generally been believed, but through some scheme on your family's part that he was fortunate enough to discover and escape before the marriage could be finalized." Lady Ashcombe's gaze was not unkind, but it was searching, careful, the gaze of a woman determined to protect someone she loved from being deceived. "I do not repeat these things to wound you, Miss Hale. I repeat them because I would rather hear your response directly than allow rumor to shape my opinion unchallenged." Charlotte felt heat and cold move through her in equal measure, heat at the sheer, deliberate cruelty of the lie, cold at the realization of how quickly and thoroughly it had already begun to spread. "Lady Ashcombe, I do not know who has told you such things, but I assure you they are entirely false. My family's finances have indeed suffered in recent years, due to unfortunate business investments, and I will not pretend otherwise. But there was no scheme, no attempt to trap Mr. Ashford into marriage. He left me standing at the church on our wedding day and married a wealthier woman within the month. That is the whole of the truth, however painful it may be to hear or to repeat." Lady Ashcombe studied her for a long moment, and Charlotte forced herself to meet the older woman's gaze steadily, refusing to let the old shame creep into her expression despite how badly it wished to. "That is not the account I was given," Lady Ashcombe said finally. "Then whoever gave you that account lied to you, Lady Ashcombe, and I would very much like to know who." Charlotte kept her voice level, though her hands had begun to tremble slightly in her lap. "I have spent 5 years enduring the consequences of Mr. Ashford's cowardice. I will not sit quietly while someone rewrites the story to suggest I was the architect of my own humiliation." Something shifted in Lady Ashcombe's expression, not full trust, not yet, but a genuine reconsideration. "You speak with considerable conviction, Miss Hale." "I speak with the conviction of someone who has told this same painful truth so many times that I have long since run out of patience for pretending otherwise, even to spare myself further embarrassment." Charlotte set down her teacup, her composure fraying slightly at the edges despite her best efforts. "I do not know what your nephew intends by his attention toward me, Lady Ashcombe. I have not asked, because I did not wish to seem as though I were calculating some advantage from it. But I will not stand accused of scheming to trap a man into marriage when the entire painful truth is that I have spent 5 years being punished for a scheme that was never mine." Lady Ashcombe was quiet for a long moment, studying Charlotte with an expression that had softened considerably from its earlier wariness. "I believe you, Miss Hale," she said finally, "though I confess I would very much like to know the source of such a deliberate falsehood." "As would I, Lady Ashcombe, as would I." But even as she said it, a cold certainty was already settling in Charlotte's chest, a suspicion that pointed clearly, unmistakably, toward two people who had every reason in the world to wish her fresh happiness undone. She did not yet know how far Beatrice and Henry's scheme had already spread, nor how quickly it would reach the one person whose opinion, she had begun to realize with quiet, frightening clarity, mattered more to her than any other in London. Nathaniel heard the rumor for the first time from a business associate over dinner at his club, delivered with the particular relish some men reserved for gossip they believed might be of use. He had dismissed it immediately, his tone cold enough to discourage the man from repeating the tale a second time, but the words had lodged themselves uncomfortably in his mind regardless, resurfacing at odd moments over the following days despite his every effort to reason them away. It was not that he believed the rumor precisely. He had spent enough hours in Charlotte's company to trust his own judgment of her character over the whispered speculation of men who knew her only by reputation. But he had also spent a great many years learning, through painful experience, that people rarely showed him their true faces until circumstances forced the truth into the open, and some small, wary part of him, the same part that had built his cold reputation in the first place, could not entirely silence the question the rumor had planted. He resolved, finally, to simply ask her directly, trusting that the honesty which had defined their acquaintance from its very first evening would serve them both better than allowing suspicion to fester unspoken. He found her 3 days later at a small gathering hosted by mutual acquaintances, and requested a private moment in the garden, with a formality that immediately told Charlotte something had shifted between them. "You have heard something," she said quietly, once they were alone among the quiet hedges before he had spoken a single word. "I can see it in your face." "I have heard several things," Nathaniel said carefully, "which I would rather discuss directly with you than allow to fester unaddressed." Charlotte's chest tightened, though she forced herself to remain steady. "Then ask me directly, Nathaniel. Whatever it is." "I have heard," he said, his voice measured but not unkind, "that your engagement to Mr. Ashford ended not through his cowardice, as you told me, but through some scheme on the part of your family that he discovered and rightfully escaped. I have heard that your family's financial difficulties have driven you to pursue my attention with rather more calculation than affection." He paused. "I do not repeat these things because I believe them entirely. I repeat them because I find I cannot simply dismiss them without first hearing your response." Charlotte felt something cold and heavy settle in her stomach, the particular, familiar ache of being doubted yet again, even by someone she had allowed herself, foolishly perhaps, to hope might see her differently. "And what response would satisfy you, Nathaniel? I have already told Lady Ashcombe the truth of what happened 5 years ago. I do not know what more I can offer beyond my word, which apparently carries less weight than the word of whoever has chosen to spread these lies." "I am not doubting your word, Charlotte. I am asking you to understand why I might need to hear it directly, given the position I occupy and the number of people who have attempted, over the years, to use me for my fortune and title. I understand your caution, Nathaniel. I do. I have spent 5 years being cautious myself, guarding against exactly the kind of cruelty that created this rumor in the first place. Her voice trembled slightly, though she fought to keep it steady. But I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that what had grown between us these past weeks might have earned me the benefit of your trust, rather than requiring me to defend myself yet again against lies I did not create. I am not asking you to defend yourself. I am asking you to speak with me honestly, as we have always spoken with one another. I have spoken with you honestly from the very first evening we met, Charlotte said, her composure finally beginning to crack under the weight of old wounds reopened by new suspicion. I told you the truth about Henry Ashford before anyone else had the chance to twist it. I told you the truth about my family's difficulties without waiting to be asked. I have given you nothing but honesty, Nathaniel, and it seems that is still not enough to outweigh a rumor spread by people who wish to see me humiliated. Charlotte. No, let me finish. Her eyes had grown bright with tears she refused to let fall. I understand better than most what it is to be doubted, to have your circumstances discussed and reshaped by people who have never once bothered to ask you the truth directly. I thought, when you told me your own story in my garden, that we understood one another in that particular pain. I see now that understanding runs only in one direction. That is not fair. Perhaps not. But it is how it feels, Nathaniel, and I find I no longer have the strength to pretend otherwise, not even for the sake of a connection I have come to value more than I intended to. She drew a shaking breath, gathering the last of her composure around herself like armor. I think, perhaps, it would be best if we did not continue this acquaintance. I cannot spend whatever years might follow constantly proving my honesty against whatever lie someone next decides to construct. I have spent 5 years already living that particular exhaustion. I find I have no wish to spend 50 more. She turned before he could respond, walking quickly back toward the house, and Nathaniel stood alone among the quiet hedges, the cold weight of her words settling over him with a force that felt, unexpectedly, very much like grief. He told himself in the days that followed that he had been right to ask, that any reasonable man in his position would have sought clarity rather than allowing suspicion to grow unaddressed. But the reasoning felt hollow against the memory of Charlotte's bright, wounded eyes, against the particular ache of having caused pain to someone he had, without quite realizing it, come to care for more deeply than he had allowed himself to admit. He threw himself into business matters with a fierce, deliberate focus, attempting to bury the discomfort beneath the familiar rhythm of ledgers and negotiations. But even in the middle of important meetings, he found his mind drifting back to their conversation in the garden, to the particular quality of honesty in her voice when she had spoken of understanding humiliation, to the warmth that had grown between them across a handful of quiet, honest afternoons. It was his aunt, finally, who forced him to confront what he had been avoiding. "You have been unbearable to be around this past week," Lady Ashcombe informed him bluntly, arriving unannounced at his townhouse with the particular determination of a woman who had raised him since boyhood and had no patience for his usual reserve. "I assume this has something to do with Miss Hale, given that you have not mentioned her name once, which is precisely 3 times more suspicious than if you had mentioned it constantly." "I do not wish to discuss it, Aunt." "I did not ask whether you wish to discuss it. I informed you that I intend to discuss it regardless." Lady Ashcombe settled herself into a chair with the air of a woman prepared to remain as long as necessary. "I spoke with Miss Hale myself, some days ago, regarding the very rumor I suspect has caused whatever rift now exists between you. She defended herself with more conviction and honesty than I have heard from anyone in this entire wretched season, Nathaniel. I believed her entirely." "I did not say I disbelieved her." "You did not need to say it. Your face has said it clearly enough for the both of you, ever since whatever conversation occurred between you." His aunt's expression softened slightly. "I have watched you build walls around yourself for 15 years, Nathaniel, ever since your father's death taught you that trust was a luxury you could not afford. I understand why. I have never once faulted you for it. But I have also watched you, these past weeks, become something closer to the boy I remember before that particular lesson hardened you entirely. I would hate to see you retreat behind those walls again, over a lie constructed by people small enough to resent someone else's happiness. Nathaniel said nothing for a long moment, his jaw tight, his gray eyes fixed on some middle distance that had nothing to do with the room around him. "I have already made inquiries," his aunt continued, more gently now, "and I have every reason to believe the rumor originated with Miss Lowell and a certain Mr. Ashford, whose own resentments regarding Miss Hale's recent good fortune are rather transparent to anyone willing to look closely. I do not say this to instruct you in what to do, Nathaniel. You are a grown man, and considerably too stubborn to accept instruction gracefully in any case. I say it only because I think you already suspect it, and have simply been too proud or too frightened to act on that suspicion." "I am not frightened of anything, Aunt." "No," Lady Ashcombe rose, smoothing her skirts with the calm efficiency of a woman who had delivered precisely the message she had come to deliver. "Then, I suggest you demonstrate that particular courage where it actually matters, Nathaniel, before pride costs you something considerably more valuable than a business negotiation ever could." She left him alone in his study with her words hanging heavy in the quiet room, and Nathaniel sat for a long while afterward, staring at nothing in particular, feeling the slow, uncomfortable dawn of a realization he had spent the past week trying very hard to avoid. He had let old wounds speak louder than present truth. He had asked Charlotte to prove her honesty yet again, when she had already given him nothing but honesty from their very first conversation. And in doing so, he had wounded the one person who had never once asked anything of him beyond simple, honest connection. He rose from his chair with sudden, decisive purpose, understanding at last exactly what he needed to do, and exactly how publicly he intended to do it. The Ashcombe family hosted a second grand ball 2 weeks later, an event that had been planned for months and that half of London had been anticipating with considerable excitement, though Charlotte had initially intended to decline the invitation entirely. It was Lucy who finally convinced her otherwise. "You cannot hide in your townhouse forever, Charlotte. Whatever happened between you and the Duke, you have done nothing wrong, and I refuse to let Beatrice Lowell believe she has succeeded in driving you into hiding." "It is not hiding, Lucy. It is simply preserving what remains of my dignity." "It is hiding," Lucy said firmly, dressed up in prettier words. "Now put on your best gown, because we are attending this ball, and you are going to walk into that room with your head held exactly as high as it deserves to be held." Charlotte allowed herself to be persuaded, though her stomach remained tight with anxiety the entire carriage ride to Ashcombe House, and tighter still as she stepped once again into the grand ballroom where this entire strange, painful, wonderful chapter of her life had first begun. She saw him almost immediately, standing near the far end of the room in conversation with several gentlemen, and felt the familiar ache in her chest at the sight of him, sharp and unwelcome and entirely unavoidable. She told herself firmly that she would simply avoid him for the evening, would enjoy whatever small comforts the night offered, and would return home with her dignity intact, whatever else might be lost. She did not get the chance. "Miss Hale," Beatrice's voice arrived at her side with its usual sharp sweetness, though there was something new in her expression tonight, something almost triumphant. "How brave of you to attend, given the circumstances." "What circumstances would those be, Beatrice?" "Oh, come now, everyone has heard that the Duke has quite lost interest, given certain revelations about your family's rather desperate financial scheming." Beatrice's smile widened. "I did warn you once that some men are particular about such things." Charlotte felt heat rise in her cheeks, old humiliation and fresh anger warring in equal measure, but before she could formulate a response, a voice cut through the surrounding noise with a coldness that made the entire nearby crowd fall instantly silent. "I would be very careful, Miss Lowell, about continuing to repeat a lie you yourself constructed." The Duke of Rothmere had crossed the room without Charlotte noticing, and now stood only a few feet away, his gray eyes fixed on Beatrice with an expression of such controlled, formidable anger that several nearby guests actually took a small step backward. Beatrice's confident smile faltered. "Your Grace, I do not know what you mean." I believe you know precisely what I mean. Nathaniel's voice carried clearly across the now silent portion of the ballroom, drawing curious attention from every direction. I have spent the past week making rather thorough inquiries into the origin of certain rumors concerning Miss Hale's family circumstances and the true nature of her broken engagement. I have spoken with 3 separate witnesses who confirm that you, Miss Lowell, in conversation with Mr. Henry Ashford, deliberately constructed and spread falsehoods designed to damage Miss Hale's reputation and undermine any attachment that might form between us. A murmur rippled through the crowd, growing louder as more guests turned to watch, drawn by the unmistakable weight of scandal unfolding in real time. "That is a serious accusation, Your Grace," Beatrice said, though her voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "It is a serious accusation because it describes a serious act of cruelty," Nathaniel replied, unmoved. "You took a woman who had already suffered genuine humiliation at the hands of a man too cowardly to honor his commitments, and you attempted to compound that suffering with deliberate lies, purely because her recent good fortune wounded your own vanity." Across the room, Charlotte saw Henry Ashford attempting, unsuccessfully, to slip toward the exit before attention could turn fully toward him, though the crowd's collective gaze had already begun tracking his movement with dawning recognition. "Mr. Ashford," Nathaniel called, his voice carrying easily across the ballroom, "I would ask that you not leave quite yet. I believe several people here would be interested to hear your own account of the conversation you shared with Miss Lowell regarding Miss Hale's supposed scheming." Henry froze, his face draining of color as every eye in the ballroom turned toward him. "I have no wish to discuss private conversations in a public setting, Your Grace." "I imagine you do not," Nathaniel said, his tone edged with contempt. "It is considerably easier to spread cruel falsehoods in quiet corners than to defend them in the full light of public scrutiny. But I find myself, tonight, rather determined that the truth should finally receive the same public airing that the lie has already enjoyed." He turned then, his gray eyes finding Charlotte across the crowded room, and something in his expression softened entirely, the cold fury giving way to something warmer, more vulnerable, more honest than she had ever seen him display in public. "Miss Hale," he said, and though his voice remained steady, there was an unmistakable tremor of feeling beneath it that carried clearly to every corner of the silent ballroom. "I owe you an apology, offered as publicly as the doubt that wounded you was allowed to spread. I let old fears speak louder than the honesty you had given me from the very first evening we met. You told me the truth about your past before anyone else had the chance to twist it. You told me the truth about your family's circumstances without waiting to be asked. And when a lie constructed by people too small to bear your happiness reached my ears, I asked you to prove, yet again, what you had already proven a dozen times over. That was unworthy of the trust you had shown me, and unworthy of the connection I have come to value more than I have valued anything in a great many years." Charlotte felt tears rising, unbidden, as the entire ballroom watched, holding its collective breath. "I do not offer this apology quietly, in some private corner where it might go unnoticed," Nathaniel continued, crossing the remaining distance between them with slow, deliberate steps until he stood directly before her. "I offer it here, in front of every person who has ever doubted your worth, every person who has ever mocked you for a wound that was never your fault, because I want it understood, clearly and permanently, that Charlotte Hale has never once, in the entire span of our acquaintance, given me anything but honesty, courage, and a kindness that this room has done far too little to deserve." The silence in the ballroom had taken on a different quality entirely now, charged and breathless, every guest leaning subtly forward to catch whatever came next. "I do not know if you can forgive the doubt I allowed myself to feel," Nathaniel said, his voice dropping to something more private, though it still carried clearly through the hushed room. "But I find I cannot bear the thought of continuing without at least asking. Charlotte, I have spent 15 years building walls around myself, convinced that trust was a weakness I could not afford. You have spent 5 years enduring cruelty you did nothing to deserve, convinced that happiness was simply not meant for you. I think perhaps we have both been wrong. I would like very much to spend the rest of my life proving it to you, if you will allow me the chance." He lowered himself, unmistakably, to one knee before her, and the collective gasp that rose from the surrounding crowd seemed to shake the very chandeliers above them. "Charlotte Hale," he said, his gray eyes steady and open and entirely unguarded, "will you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife?" Charlotte stood frozen for a long moment, tears spilling freely down her cheeks now, aware of every eye in the ballroom fixed upon her, aware of her mother somewhere behind her making a sound that was half sob and half laugh, aware of Lucy's hand pressed tight against her own mouth in stunned delight. She thought of 5 years standing at the edges of rooms just like this one. She thought of every whispered cruelty, every pitying glance, every reminder that she had somehow failed at the one thing the world believed a woman was meant to accomplish. She thought of a quiet garden and an honest conversation and a man who had shown her, for the first time in longer than she could remember, what it felt like to be truly seen rather than simply observed and dismissed. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking slightly with the force of her own joy. "Yes, Nathaniel, I will." The ballroom erupted into sound, applause, exclamations, the particular joyful chaos that follows any moment of genuine happiness witnessed collectively by a crowd that had, only minutes before, been holding its breath in scandalized silence. Nathaniel rose and drew her into an embrace that felt, after everything, like coming home to a place she had never quite believed existed. Somewhere near the edge of the crowd, Beatrice Lowell stood frozen, her face pale with the dawning realization that her scheme had not only failed, but had, in its failure, created the very public triumph she had hoped desperately to prevent. Henry Ashford had already slipped from the room entirely, unwilling to remain and witness the full measure of his own diminishment. But Charlotte, held securely in the arms of a man who had chosen, in front of the entire ballroom, to defend her honesty over comfortable silence, found she had no room left in her heart for either of them. She had spent 5 years being defined by other people's cruelty. Tonight, at last, she was being defined by something else entirely, by honesty, by courage, and by a love that had refused when it mattered most to remain quiet. The wedding took place on a bright morning in early autumn, in a small stone chapel Nathaniel had chosen specifically, because it was quiet and private, far from the grand cathedrals where London's most fashionable marriages were typically celebrated. Charlotte had asked him once why he preferred such a modest setting for a duke's wedding, and he had simply told her that he had spent enough of his life performing for crowds, and wished, for this one particular morning, to belong entirely to her and no one else. Margaret Hale cried through the entire ceremony, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that grew progressively damper as the morning wore on, while Richard Hale stood beside his wife with an expression of quiet, profound pride that needed no words to convey its depth. Lucy stood as Charlotte's attendant, beaming with a joy so complete it seemed to fill the entire small chapel, and Lady Ashcombe watched her nephew exchange vows with an expression that suggested she had known, long before either of them admitted it to themselves, exactly how this particular story would end. Beatrice Lowell was not invited, and the scandal surrounding her role in the false rumors had followed her through the rest of that season and well into the next. Her own social standing diminished considerably by the very cruelty she had once wielded so freely against others. Henry Ashford had quietly removed himself to the countryside not long after the ball, unable to bear the weight of London's renewed and considerably less flattering attention. Charlotte thought of them rarely in the months that followed, finding her days filled instead with a happiness so steady and complete that it left little room for old bitterness to take root. She and Nathaniel settled into a rhythm that surprised them both: long conversations over breakfast, quiet evenings spent reading in companionable silence, the particular joy of discovering, day by day, all the small details of a person they had chosen to spend the whole of their lives beside. Nathaniel's reputation for coldness softened considerably over that first year of marriage, though he remained, by nature, a serious and exacting man in matters of business. Those who knew him best began to notice small changes. A warmth in his expression that had rarely appeared before. A patience with his younger cousins that surprised everyone who remembered the distant, guarded man he had once been. An ease in Charlotte's company that suggested, finally, he had found the one place in the world where he no longer needed to guard himself at all. Charlotte, for her part, found that the whispers which had followed her for 5 long years finally, gradually, fell silent. Not because she had proven herself to anyone, not because she had finally secured the marriage society believed she owed them, but because she had stopped needing their approval to know her own worth. She had learned, through 5 painful years and 1 remarkable evening, that dignity was not something other people could grant or withhold. It was something she had carried all along, whether the ballroom chose to see it or not. On the first anniversary of that fateful ball where everything had begun, Nathaniel surprised her with a small, private dinner in the very garden where they had first spoken honestly with one another. The same roses blooming fragrant and full around them in the warm evening air. "Do you remember," he asked, taking her hand across the small table, "what you said to me that very first afternoon about kindness always arriving with a cost attached?" "I remember," Charlotte said, smiling. "I was rather cynical, as I recall." "You were cautious," he corrected gently. "You had every reason to be. I have thought of that conversation often this past year, and I find I owe you a correction to my earlier claim." "What correction is that?" "I told you there was no cost attached to my kindness that evening. I believe now that I was wrong." He lifted her hand to his lips, his gray eyes warm in the fading evening light. "The cost was my whole heart, Charlotte, given freely and entirely. The very first time I watched you bear cruelty with more grace than the room around you deserved. I did not realize it at the time. I understand it now with perfect clarity." Charlotte felt tears prick at her eyes, though these, unlike so many she had shed in ballrooms past, were tears of a happiness so complete it left no room for anything else. "Then I suppose we are even," she said softly, "for I gave you mine that same evening, and did not realize it myself until considerably later." They sat together in the quiet garden as the sun sank slowly below the rooftops of London. 2 people who had each spent years believing themselves unworthy of the very happiness they had finally, against every cruel whisper and every old wound, found in one another. The ballroom that had once mocked her for being unwed now spoke her name with an entirely different kind of reverence. And the ruthless Duke whose coldness had become legend was known, among those who truly knew him, as a man who had finally, completely, allowed himself to be loved. And Charlotte Hale, who had spent 5 long years standing quietly at the edges of every room she entered, had finally, fully, stepped into the center of her own life, exactly where she had always deserved to stand.